A Kitsune Remnant by Red Devil 360, Chapter 5, The Invisible Shinobi. Naruto watched in silence as Pyrrha silently bested Cardin in the ring after he had foolishly challenged her to a duel. It was suffice to say he wouldn't be doing that again. It was Friday of their first week at Beacon and things were moving slowly. Although this was their second lesson in the combat class, this was the first time they were actually fighting, and he wasn't overly impressed. There were, of course, some exceptions like Pyrrha, but the average strength was around Genin, low tuning if he was feeling generous. Port's lessons hadn't improved, and don't even get him started on Dr. Oobleck's classes. Although he zipped around at a speed that he could follow, his speech was another matter, and he constantly found himself baffled at what was being said and looked to Blake for an explanation, not that she knew what was said anyway. If the students who spoke it naturally couldn't understand him, then how the hell could he? Not to mention, his own lessons were scheduled for later today, his second history class, and the first of his taijutsu lessons. He wasn't looking forward to it. Every few, very few to pay attention in the history class, and even fewer to attend the hand-to-hand lessons. He was beginning to realize how Iruka felt when teaching his class in the academy. A loud buzzing sound brought him back to reality, and he bore witness to Cardin limping off the stage, with Aura in the red proudly displayed on the screen above him. Maybe next time you will choose your opponent more carefully, Mr. Winchester, Professor Goodwitch chastised sternly from the side of the arena. Now, before we finish today's lessons, are there any others who wish to duel? She asked, although a few hands went up. Yang was up so fast that it may as well have already been held up. I wish to challenge my teammate Kitsune, she yelled with a glare in his direction. I accept, Naruto answered just as the professor opened her mouth more to object. She narrowed her eyes at him, but nodded her head and gestured to the ground before her. While Yang walked off to the changing room, Naruto merely stood up from the bleachers, jumped off the balcony to the ground without a sound. Shouldn't you change into more appropriate clothing, Kitsune? She quirked, looking impotently at the uniform he was still wearing. Don't worry, Professor, I won't need to, he answered back blankly, earning himself some whispers from the audience. Ruby was worried. She knew that Yang hated her partner, but to go as far enough to challenge him to a fight was a bit much in her innocent opinion. She worried for her partner as well. Yang was no slouch, and he had yet to display his full capabilities in combat. She felt she felt a hand on her shoulder and looked to see Blake smiling at her reassuringly. Don't worry, this is only a small fight. I'm sure neither of them are going to be seriously hurt, she said, although this did nothing to relieve her worries. It didn't take long for Yang to emerge from the tunnels leading to the changing room, and when she saw Kitsune standing there in his uniform, a bored look on his face, she said nothing and smirked confidently. Glinda looked down at her scroll and pushed a few buttons, causing Yang's and Kitsune's face to appear on the large screen above them. Although Naruto didn't have the green aura bar underneath his portrait as Yang did, as Kitsune has no aura, I will determine if he is unable to continue. Do you understand? She explained, giving a pointed look to both competitors. Yang nodded a bit too eagerly and held her gauntlet fists up. Naruto merely rolled his eyes, deciding to emulate his sensei even further. He fiddled around with the inside of his blazer and pulled out a worn green book and flipped to a previously marked page and began reading. Yang's arm slacked in front of her. What are you doing? She asked irritably. Naruto looked up momentarily before going back to his book. It's called reading. You should try it sometime, he mocked, getting a few nervous chuckles from their audience. The words had the intended effect as Yang let out a growl and, using her gauntlets, boosted herself towards Naruto, swinging with a wide haymaker before Glinda even said they could start. Naruto, however, was unfazed and easily dug underneath the swing without even looking up from his book. Yang stopped a few meters away and gazed at Naruto, who had now turned to face her again. When Naruto flipped a page in his book, she boosted forward again, but this time keeping her arms close to her chest. She arrived in front of and threw a series of jabs and punches. Each and every one of them were dodged by Naruto without him even looking up from his book. Getting angrier by the minute, Yang sped up her punches and began adding kicks as well. Yet Naruto still dodged them, occasionally turning a page in his book to add to the frustration. Yang backed off again and growled, her eyes turning red as her semblance activated. Why don't you take me seriously? She yelled angrily. Naruto looked up and cocked his head. Would you like me to? His opponent getting into a fighting stance as well. was all the answer he needed. He sighed, and his body was briefly obscured from view by smoke. When he returned, he was still holding his book, but he now wore his Jonin outfit, minus the cloak. With a snap, he closed the book and slipped it into his kunai pouch. He gripped the handle of his ninjato and began unsheathing it. "Tell me, Yang, do you fear death?" he asked, the eerie sound of his blade unsheathing accentuating his words. Yang snorted and narrowed her eyes. "No!" she said, and took a step forward. She froze. The reason for this was because her opponent was no longer in front of her, but rather crouched next to her, with his blade held across her throat. "Well, then you're a fool. Brave, perhaps, but a brave fool is still a fool." His voice was as cold as his eyes were, dead and unfeeling, a stark contrast to the bored demeanor he had always held. This was what a shinobi was, a cold-hearted killer. It terrified her more than the stories and reports ever did, and she slept in the same room as him. Yang shivered in fear and dropped her arms from the battle-ready position. "I yield," she whispered, although the whole room still heard her despite its size. The professor nodded and raised a hand. "Winner by yield is Kitsune," she announced, happy that their duel was over. No one clapped, however. How could they? They just watched the most one-sided fight they have probably ever witnessed, and neither actually landed a hit. Naruto backed away and resheathed his sword, his previous bored manner firmly back in place, as if it had never left it in the first place. Without as much as a second word, he turned and began walking off the arena floor. "Pyrrha, you would like to fight?" he asked, stopping and turning around to look at the girl in question, who had frozen in surprise at being spotted at the entrance to the tunnel. She stood straight and nodded resoundingly. He gestured to the space opposite him and unsheathed his own blade, holding it lazily in front of him. Pyrrha occupied her place, holding Akuo in front of her, and Milo in its sword form held ready. She stood side on so that her shield covered her body, but only enough where she could easily counter with her right when he attacked. The perfect balance between attack and defense. He was already rather impressed. "Are both combatants ready?" Glinda asked from the side, earning nods from both. She pressed a button on her scroll and backed off slightly. The chimes of a countdown echoed before a buzzer sounded when it must have hit 0. Pyra advanced off her position in a much calmer fashion than Yang, and Naruto moved to meet her halfway. Deciding to start off the fight, Naruto swung his ninjato in a low arc, which Pyra blocked with Akuo, and half-heartedly retaliated with Milo. She knew that the shinobi didn't possess aura, and every hit that they take themselves. She didn't want to potentially hurt her new and currently only friend other than her teammates in Beacon. Naruto caught her wrist and put pressure on her shield, holding both in place. "Are you afraid to hurt me, Pyro?" he asked curiously. The girl in question blushed at being caught. "I'm aware that you don't possess aura like we do. I don't want to accidentally hurt you," she admitted. To her surprise, he chuckled. "If I couldn't take a few hits, Pyra, I would be a pretty lousy shinobi." He let go of her wrist and pushed off her shield, backing away a few paces. He looked at her critically. "They say you won 4 tournaments and call you the Invincible Girl," he commented, noting how she frowned at the nickname. He twirled his blade and pointed it at her. "Show me why!" His opponent looked at him with new determination and advanced again. She flung high, which Naruto deflected and then dodged back when she went in for a shield bash, making her miss. She saw Milo return for a stab out the corner of his eye and spun out the way. Launching a kick at Pyra, she blocked it, but it served its purpose and caused her to slide back slightly. Not one to be deterred, she switched Milo to its javelin form and attacked again. Momentarily caught off guard by the increase in range, Naruto barely managed to deflect the strikes before moving and closing the distance between them. Pyro blocked a few strikes with Akuo as she switched Milo back to sword form and swung in a few counters. They traded blows like this for a few minutes, neither gaining an advantage in the fight. Despite being calmer and more collected than Yang, Pyro couldn't help but become frustrated. No matter what she did, Kitsune was always there to match her. Speed up, he got faster, add more strength to her blows. he pushed her back. Any and all tricks she used were dodged or blocked, and she was always kept at arm's length. Switching to javelin form again, a few precious strikes forced Kitsune to back off. Then, hoping to finally catch him off guard, she changed to her rifle form and took a few quick shots. Her gambit paid off, and Kitsune received a small cut across his shoulder before he managed to block the other bullets. Disappearing in the blur and reappearing across the other side of the arena, Naruto chuckled, sighing. He probed the injury on his shoulder and assessed that it was nothing to worry about. You hunters and your transformable weapons, he teased. I never really understood that about you people. It must be hell to maintain. Just choose a weapon and keep to it, he shrugged. Pyro smiled. It is rather difficult to maintain without the gears and moving parts, but the versatility gained is worth the effort, she explained, Milo's sword form present again in her hand. She looked at him worriedly. How is your shoulder? She asked, concerned. Naruto I smiled. Worry not, it's only a scratch. I've certainly had worse. Pyro nodded and got into a stance. As you did with Blake, I would like the honor of fighting you seriously. Naruto raised a brow but nodded, turning to face her side on with his right leg stretched out in front of him and his left bent. He raised his sword above his head so that it ran across his right arm towards Pyro's feet. Taking the initiative again, Pyro fired another shot. Naruto swung in a flash of silver, and two distinct clinks signed the fact that he just cut the bullet in half. Deciding that the ranged route wasn't going to be effective anymore, she tried switching to her javelin again, but halfway through another silver blur appeared and a shuriken struck itself into the gear system, not only halting it in its tracks, but also knocking it out of her hands and across the arena floor. She contemplated using her semblance to retrieve it, but before she could, she instinctively raised her arm in time to receive a heavy double-footed kick to her shield, knocking her apparently off balance. Naruto capitalized on this and appeared below her, swiping a leg out to take her off her feet, and using this momentum, his raised arms, and lashed out with a devastating roundhouse kick to Pyra's side while she was still mid-fall. In combination with being thrown across the arena, Pyra's aura shattered. It was only by the grace of Professor Goodwich's telekinetic semblance that she avoided slamming directly into the wall. Another buzzed sound off, signaling the end of the fight. Not that they needed it. Kitsu wins by aura depletion, Glinda announced in a muted voice. Even she was surprised by how easily Kitsune dispatched Pyrrha in a single hit. Naruto sheathed his ninja toe and walked over to where Pyrrha had sat up, and somewhat gathered her wits and held out a hand for her to take. With a small smile, she did so. I guess that was rather silly of me, but I had to see how we compared, she commented as Naruto hauled her to her feet. She studied him for a moment. You still didn't go all out. Why? She wondered. Naruto chuckled. You may be strong for your age group, Pyrrha, the strongest in this room, bearing myself and Professor Goodwich, but I am a professional killer for a reason, and I don't think that the Academy, or the kingdoms for the matter, would take kindly to the fact that I killed a student in a sparring match. Do you? With his piece said, Pyrrha shocked that he openly admitted to the fact that he could have killed her. He turned and walked out the arena. A bell rung as soon as he entered the tunnel, telling the people that the lesson just ended. Naruto sat in the cafeteria with both his team and Team Periwinkle, half listening to Nara babble about the likely false story and half picking at his food. Truth be told, he was rather homesick, and although his had been on numerous long-haul missions, he was never this far away from home and still on his own continent. Not to mention it had been nearly 2 months since he'd had a good bowl of ramen, not the cheap stuff they served here. Although he tended to be quiet on a normal basis, he was never this quiet, and it seemed to have drawn the attention of both his partner and Pyrrha, who, unlike Yang, was not sour about her defeat. She's been having this recurring dream for a while now, Ren concluded to their audience. Pyrrha took the opportunity to speak up. Kitsune, are you alright? Naruto glanced up and waved her off. Just thinking of home. Oh, what's it like? Ruby asked eagerly. It seemed as though her question brought the attention of the other present at the table. Naruto looked at her curiously before putting down his fork and reaching into his jacket. He pulled out the photo of Konoha he had taken from atop the Hokage monument. He looked over it fondly as he passed it to Ruby. My village, Konoha, sits in the largest forest in the elemental nation, giving it the name of the Hidden Leaf Village. It's a home. It's just over to 100,000 people, most of which are civilians. It's a quiet and homely place with some of the best hot springs around, not to mention the ramen. He paused here slightly, a faraway look in his eyes. It's hot during the summer and mild in winter. Occasionally it can snow if the weather is cold enough. The people there are friendly but scared of the unknown. However, you will never be far from help should you need it. I would gladly give my life for my village, just as many have already done before me. He trailed off at that point, giving his full attention to the leaf headband he had taken out of some pocket. The tension on the table wavered in favor of a commotion a few tables away. Turned out to be Cardin along with his team picking on the rabbit fawn as velvet from his lessons with Ublik. Atrocious, Pyrrha hissed. I can't stand people like him, she said as they continued to watch. You're not the only one, Blake muttered along with the rest. Ruby, wanna bet I can hit all four? Naruto asked. Ruby, along with the rest of the table, turned to the resident shinobi, who was throwing an apple up and down in the air. What? Was the intelligent response. Bounce bonus points if you hit Cardin in the groin. Nora piped up with a slight evil grin. Only Cardin, you make it too easy, Miss Valkyrie. Naruto quipped before briefly standing and throwing the apple fast enough that blurred. The apple reappeared as it slammed into Sky's face, rebounded off of Russell's head and into Dove's nose, where it proceeded to angle down and impact right into Cardin's family's jewel. All four members of Team Cardinal hit the ground in a groaning mess, allowing Velvet time to escape. Although wondering what on earth happened, Naruto smiled in amusement as Nora jumped up with a cheer and the others giggled or chuckled in Ren's case. Now that that's done with, you'll excuse me because I have to prepare for my lesson in half an hour, Naruto said as he stood and vacated his spot from the table, nodding at the various farewells he received. Naruto sat in his meditation position atop his desk in the classroom assigned to his lesson with his eyes closed. Wednesday, he had his first lesson with the third and fourth years that went moderately well. In just a few minutes, he would be teaching the first and second years, including his own team, and he wasn't sure where to begin. He was giving the shorter version to the higher years as they would be around less and leaving soon in the case for the fourth years. However, the lower years were around for a minimum of 3 years, so he was expecting to go into full detail about his country's history and lore, meaning he had a lot to cover. Much like in Dr. Ublik's class, Naruto had placed a large map of the elemental nations behind him on the wall, with all the separate countries and major cities marked, minus the hidden villages, of course. Along with that, he had dotted around the room other such memorabilia, pictures of plants, sketches, and paintings of what people thought mythical creatures might look like. He was even allowed to include some older versions of weapons currently in use, such as the full set of samurai armor sat in the corner on a stand complete with a katana and wakizashi. After a few minutes, first sensed the presence of students approaching, soon followed by their voices. Not long after, he heard the door open and the students beginning to file in. Though he still kept his eyes closed, this was their first lesson as his students. Patience. The higher years were more willing to wait for him to start their class, and it was a good 10 minutes before they cracked. Now he wanted to see what the younger ones did, and he was rather disappointed it wasn't even 2 minutes before they started to get rowdy. There were those that weren't his own team. Once again, Bar Yang waited patiently, though Ruby seemed to be struggling, and Team Periwinkle did so as well, including Whis, surprisingly, though he suspected it was more to keep the 100% record on a real interest in the class. The final straw was when a student, after being egged on by his classmate, threw a ball of paper towards him with the intent of hitting him in the face. The whole class was promptly shut up when he caught it and threw it back at the perpetrator without even opening his eyes. Sighing in resignation, he opened his eyes and hopped off his desk. Now that you've decided to settle down, he glared at the student picking himself off the floor after being struck by his own paper ball. We can begin. Naruto began, still in his shonen uniform, foregoing any formal attire. My name, as most of you probably know it, is Kitsune, and over the course of the next 3 to 4 years, I'm going to teach you about my homeland, and you are going to learn. And why would we do that? One non-script student asked. Because, quite frankly, the headmaster is telling you to. When he said that my class counted for 20% of your overall grade, he wasn't lying. He almost smiled at the groans he received. I'm going to teach you about myth, legend, truth, tragedy, wars, and consequences, heroes and villains, the food we eat, the buildings we live in. He explained, pausing when there was a knock on the door. Enter, he said, allowing the green-haired professor to enter. Dr. Oobleck, how can I help you? He questioned. The professor pushed up his glasses with a smile. Yes, I was curious if I could sit on in your lessons. As a scholar, I am rather interested in the world as a whole, and after conversing with a few of my students about your class, I became rather curious. He asked rather quickly. Naruto chuckled. By all means, doctor. I would be more than happy for you to sit in. There's a free seat in the front row next to Team Ruby. He gestured. After his newest arrival zipped to his seat, he continued, now, as I was saying, Ospen asked me to teach this class to help you better understand my people, just as I am here to better understand yours. All I ask of you is to come to this class with a willingness to learn and to respect me and my people's beliefs and way of life as I will yours. Naruto instructed, garnering himself a few nods. Nodding himself, Naruto began the lesson properly. Good. Now it all started with the collective of gods we call the Hoto Matsukami. Line break. And that is how we believe our world began, creating the Shinto religion. Naruto finished just in time for the bell to ring. Thank you for your attention. Your homework will be a 2-page essay on today's lesson using pages 15 through 22 in your textbooks for next lesson. I've already taken the liberty of adding some books to the library if you need extra help. He called over the commotion of the class packing up. Amazing, simply amazing, Oobleck explained as he walked over. I can't help but marvel at how our two main religions differ. While our pertains to a single omnipotent power, yours, on the other hand, is a collection of gods, each having their own role in creating and governing the known world. He gushed speedily. I must say, young Kitsune, your history is even more interesting than I thought. I hope you don't mind if I stick around, do you, and learn more? He probed. Naruto chuckled. I would be more than happy for your presence, Doctor, and believe me, we're only getting started. After all, this is the first lesson of many. With a smile and a thankful handshake, Oobleck left, allowing Team Ruby and Periwinkle to take his place in congratulation to their friend in a good class. So now that's done, what are we going to do? I mean, we have an hour or two before the end of the day. Blake queried. We could get a few hours training in. Team exercises sound good. Ruby offered. You guys go on. I'm afraid I've got paperwork to take care of. Naruto sighed. Paperwork? Pyrrha questioned. Naruto hummed and turned to his desk, which was full of bits of papers and scrolls. Yes, it seems even thousands of miles away it follows me, he explained mournfully. To their surprise, Whis nodded in understanding. I get that. I've been studying in preparation to take over the Schnee Dust Company, and occasionally my father makes me do a portion of the paperwork to build experience, she explained. It was a nightmare at the best of times. She violently shivered, receiving a pat on the shoulder from Naruto in the first show of friendship between the two. Now off with you. I'd rather get started on this before it starts breeding more. Naruto shooed to turn around to an even bigger pile when they left. Fuck! Naruto walked into one of the training rooms set aside for his taijutsu lessons a few minutes before it was about to begin. It was a modest room, about the same size as the classrooms. In the center of the room, 3 rows of 3 mats, creating a grid of 9. Along the walls were various punching bags, weights, and other such instruments to build one's strength. In addition, along the back wall, opposite the entrance, stood 9 wooden puppets, much like the ones the three Roiden brothers used when they tried to take revenge on Might Guy. Having changed out of his Jonin uniform and into something more appropriate for training, he now wore a loose light gray sleeveless kimono jacket over a t-shirt, bandages that covered his hands and were bound up until the crook of his elbow, and the loose darker gray trousers that ended mid-shine. The sounder of The sound of chatter alerted him to the fact that his new students were now arriving, and Naruto turned to greet them, hiding his surprise at the fact there were nearly 3 dozen of them in total when he didn't expect even 10. Among them were Team Periwinkle minus the W, Ruby and Blake, as well as a few others that Naruto recognized from both his classes as a student and teacher. "Good evening, everyone," he greeted with a respectful nod. "Before we begin with these lessons, how many of you have had experience in hand-to-hand?" he asked. Barely a fifth of those gathered raised their hands. "Oh boy, this is gonna take some work," he thought with an inward sigh. End of chapter 5.